Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Are the Prime Minister and the CEO of Niti Aayog correct in claiming that India has already overtaken Japan and become the fourth largest economy in the world? Or could they have jumped the gun by 6 months? Beyond that, are there reasons to question the IMF's projections on which this claim is based? And if those reasons are justified, where does the claim that India will become the fourth largest economy in December 2025 actually stand? Those are the key issues I shall discuss today with the former professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University and the author of The Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis, Professor Arun Kumar. Professor Kumar, let's start with the claim made both by the Prime Minister and the CEO of Niti Aayog that India has overtaken Japan and is now the fourth largest economy in the world. This is based upon IMF projections, but the IMF makes it clear this will happen at the end of financial year 2025, which is only, as far as the IMF is concerned, December 2025. It hasn't happened as yet. Doesn't that mean that both the Prime Minister and the CEO of Niti Aayog have jumped the gun? They should have waited 6 months more.
Or, as Karan, you say, it'll happen in December. They could have been more accurate in saying it will happen at the end of the year. That would have been more accurate, because what is happening is that the IMF is projecting these figures on the basis of the trends in the past few years and on the basis of the data that has come in for 24-25. And the final data for 24-25 will come only today. So it has not yet come. They may have some advanced information about it, but still, any projection has to be made on the basis of the past growth and the current year's actual GDP. So they could have said it'll happen at the end of the year, but they can't say it has already happened.
So you agree that A, they jumped the gun, and
Yes.
B, they were roughly 6 months ahead of time.
Absolutely right.
Now, second, even when India overtakes Japan in terms of the overall size of its GDP, the important point to remember is that its per capita income will be only 1/13 of Japan's per capita income calculated in nominal dollar terms. Isn't that more significant than the absolute size of the GDP?
You are right, because the absolute size of the GDP depends on the number of people you have and the per capita income that they have. Per capita income represents the welfare of the people. So if a country has a much larger per capita income, that means the welfare there is better. And the welfare can be measured in a variety of ways. So the average Indian is much poorer than the average Japanese. So as you say, 1/13 of the size of Japan, because the size being the same, the population being 1/13, the per capita income becomes 1/13. And therefore, in education, in health, in R&D, and so on, Japan is much better off than India. So coming to the same GDP does not mean that we are much better off or we are the same as well off as Japan.
So I'll just underline that point. We may inch ahead of Japan in terms of the absolute size of our GDPs, but in terms of the actual standing of the people, in terms of per capita income, Japan is 13 times ahead of us.
That's right. That's right. So they're much better off. And to be developed, we need technology. And in technology, we are way behind the advanced countries. So even if we have a higher GDP than, say, Japan or France or Britain, but in technology terms and welfare terms, we are much behind those countries.
Thirdly, on the face of it, India's GDP at $4.187 trillion seems large. But how much of that is a reflection of the fact that we have a population of 1.4 billion, the largest in the world?
So, as I was saying, per capita income multiplied by the population is what gives you the total GDP. So, if you have a much larger population, roughly 13 times the Japanese population, that's why we equal them, even though our per capita income terms we are much poorer. And the other factor that's very essential in this is what is the unemployment in the economy? Because if you have unemployment, that means people have to support each other. There's a dependency ratio. Those who are employed have to support the unemployed. Japan has a much lower unemployment rate than India has. And that too, the official data shows that the unemployment is only 8%. But if you go by the ILO data and by other, international data, then the unemployment of different kinds, which is there, is much larger in India. In other words, even though we have a large population, but those who are working, those who are earning and supporting the family, they are fewer. So the labor force participation rate, as it's called, of the relevant age group of 15 to 64, how many people are working? That's the labor force participation rate. Japan has a much higher labor force participation rate than India, even though their older population is much larger, which means that the number of people working and earning, as a percentage of the family, that's greater in Japan than in India. And therefore, the prosperity level also becomes greater. India's labor force participation rate, as per the government's official data, is about 55, 58%. But other big economies like USA, Brazil, etc., they have a labor force participation rate of roughly about 65 to 70%. And if you go by the ILO definition, then our labor force participation rate is only about 47%. So in other words, we have 13, 14% less people working. So even though we have a larger population, but the number of people working, that being fewer, that reflects on the welfare of the family.
Absolutely. But the key point that you agree with is that our GDP of $4.187 trillion may seem large, but it's a reflection of the fact we have the world's largest population as well.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Now, in an article that you have written for The Wire, you raised a few concerns about the claim that India's GDP will overtake Japan's. Let's come to those concerns and let's take them up one by one. First, you point out that the IMF projection is based upon Indian government data. So, doesn't that mean that any errors that exist in India's data will also get reflected in IMF data? Am I right in saying that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Collecting data is a huge issue because there's so many sectors, there's so many subsectors. You have to collect data from everywhere. Even if you take the primary sector, agriculture itself is divided up into so many different sectors, industry is divided up, and no other agency than the government can actually collect that data. So the IMF, the World Bank, the ADB, they take the government data, whichever government it is, so Indian data also is taken from the government data. So any errors in the government's data will also be there in the IMF data. Of course, what the IMF and the World Bank etc. do is tweak it a little bit here and there. But broadly, if you see, their rate of growth will be exactly the same as the government's data, plus minus a little bit 0.1% here and there. So in other words, the errors are replicated in the IMF World Bank data because they're not the data gathering agencies.
Let's then at this point, Professor Kumar, come to the reasons why Indian data is sometimes considered less than reliable. First of all, the estimate for the GDP for the unorganized sector, which is pretty close to 45% of the economy, is calculated as a proxy of the GDP for the organized sector. But both demonetization and the lockdown have badly affected the relationship between the organized and the unorganized sectors. Consequently, you believe that today, any calculation of the unorganized sector using the organized sector as a proxy is not going to be accurate and reliable. It will be questionable at best.
So, Karan, you're right. And let me try and explain a little. You see, the economy is divided up between the public sector and the private sector. The public sector is entirely organized because the data for that comes. The private sector is entirely organized because the data for that comes. So, The private sector has the organized component and the unorganized component. And the unorganized component is huge. Like farming is one component of that. And there are variously estimated to be 8 crore or 11 crore farmers. Measuring what they're producing is a huge challenge. Then in the industrial sector, the non-agricultural sector, there are 6 crore micro units, 6 lakh large, 6,000 large units, and only 6 lakh small and medium units. Now you can get the data from the medium units and the large units, but getting from the small units and from the micro units, of which there are 6 crore, is a huge challenge. So what is done is that the unorganized sector data is proxied. You have to have a method for estimating that. And the method is that you look at the data of the organized sector and assume that the unorganized sector is also behaving the same way. Now, that may have been true before demonetization, because demonetization hit the unorganized sector very hard. Unorganized sector works with cash. Organized sector can work with banking, with electronic money and so on, but the unorganized sector doesn't. So the unorganized sector got hit very hard, large number of units closed down. And then this shock led to the second shock very soon after, the GST shock. The GST also, even though it exempted the unorganized sector from GST, but the unorganized sector could not get the input credit. And without the input credit, its cost rose. So therefore, the organized sector was better off, more able to take care of itself. And I'll only give the example from the pressure cooker industry. Mr. Jagannathan of the pressure cooker industry, chairman of the association, he said we are 30 units, 5 in the large scale and 25 in the small scale. And the 5, we are growing at 24% because the unorganized sector, the small scale, is unable to cope with GST. So demand has shifted to us. Now, this has happened in the case of trade also. You can see, for instance, e-commerce is growing.
So let's not get lost in detail. Basically,
Sure.
saying the relationship between the organized sector and the unorganized sector was badly affected, by
That's right.
demonetization, then by GST, then by the lockdown. Therefore, using the organized sector as a proxy for the unorganized sector no longer works.
Correct. So this proxying the unorganized sector by the organized sector doesn't work. With the organized sector has been growing at the expense of the unorganized sector. So the organized sector is growing fast, the unorganized sector is declining, and you have evidence for that from various sectors.
And
So
this means in turn that we don't really have an accurate idea of how the unorganized sector is performing. And that is at best a guess rather than an accurate idea. And when the IMF uses our data, they're reflecting the same inaccuracies in their own data.
Absolutely right. And also what happens is that a declining sector is being proxied by a rising sector, and therefore the GDP is getting overestimated.
Okay.
Because that's very important to say that it's getting overestimated, because if you proxy a declining sector by a rising sector, then you're doing damage. So in other words, the unorganized sector is invisibilized in our data.
Absolutely. And what you're saying is because we are proxying the unorganized sector on the basis of the organized sector, we're getting a false idea of how well the unorganized sector is doing. It's not doing as well. And that in turn means that the GDP is being overestimated. And that in turn means that when the IMF takes our data and projects on the basis of that data, the IMF is also overestimating our GDP. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Let's come to a second reason why you question the 2025 GDP figure. And that's because it's only a preliminary estimate at this stage based on data for a part of the year. You point out finality will only happen 2 years later, which is to say in 2027. Is it the case that between now and when we reach finality in 2027, the actual 2025 GDP figure could change? It could either grow more than we thought it would, or it could be smaller than we thought it would be. Both are possible.
Yes. So you're absolutely right. When the data is given, only quarterly data is available. So therefore, from that, projections are made for what's called the first advance estimate, then a second advance estimate, and then there's a revised estimate, and then only the final figures come. So all this process takes up to 2 years, and there are major changes that take place. So for instance, if you look at the 2015-16-17 data, initially in the first advance estimate, it was given as 7.1%. In the end, finally, it became 8.3%. Now, that's also surprising because in demonetization, we saw large number of industries close down, and yet it was 8.3%. And that's because it was based entirely on the organized sector, not the unorganized sector. But if you look at the 2019-20 data, initially it was given as 5%, and then finally it turned out to be 3.9%. So it was down by 1.1%. Similarly,
What you're saying is that if similar deviations or fluctuations happen in the case of the 2025 data, either our economy could end up being larger by 1% or 2, or it could be smaller by 1% or 2.
absolutely
In
right.
other words, at this moment in time, when we just have the first estimate of GDP for 2025, we don't really know what the final figure will be because we'll only know in 2 years' time. And that's when we can accurately say whether we have overtaken Japan or failed to do so.
Absolutely right. So we have the second advanced estimate at the moment only, and we'll have some figures today. But the point is that it can be revised. And for 22-23, it was revised downward from 7.6% to 7%. This is the most recent estimate that's available, where a 0.6% revision downwards there. Whereas the gap is only 0.014%. So a 0.6% deviation downward will mean we have not yet crossed the Japanese economy's GDP.
Now, you also argue that because GDP estimates are based on a projection from the previous year, any shock that the economy experiences, such as demonetization, GST, and the lockdown, could affect GDP calculations. Am I right in saying that that sort of shock will affect the way you measure and you account for the GDP? And secondly, how long does the effect of that shock last? How many years into the future does it go?
So, as I was mentioning, we basically use the data from the past, and we use what's called the benchmark indicators, because the unorganized sector data is not available all the time. So we take a reference here. In the reference here, we calculate what the unorganized sector, organized sector, and we create a benchmark. And we use that benchmark till the next survey data comes, right? Now that benchmark gets changed because the unorganized, organized sector ratio changes because of the shock we saw for demonetization, for GST, for NBFC crisis, and then for this. And then it's projected. In fact, I have the thing, if I can read it out. It says a key indicator or a set of key indicators for which data in volume or quantity terms is available on quarterly basis. That is what is projected. So if you're projecting from the year which we didn't have a shock to the year where there's a shock, you're not going to get the correct data. And then you use the same data for the next year after the shock. And because the data for the shock year is incorrect, the data for the next year will also be incorrect.
So it has a sort of multiplier effect.
Yeah, it's a chain effect where, one error will lead to the second error to the third error. And then what we've had is we've had different kinds of shocks. So demonetization is a different kind of shock than GST. So the kind of correction that is needed is different for demonetization, it's different for GST, and it's different for the lockdown period. So we needed to revise our methodology, we needed to revise our base year calculations so that next year's data can be correctly calculated. We haven't done this revision.
As a result of which the implication of those shocks continues to distort GDP data.
Absolutely right. And because one after the other shocks came, we can't say how much effect of the demonetization is still there, how much effect of the GST is still there post the COVID, and then the COVID shock. So we need to revise our estimation method.
All of which underlines the fact that India's GDP calculation is less than reliable. And since the IMF uses India's GDP to make its own projections, even IMF projections as a result will reflect the same lack of reliability. Yes. Let's then at this point, Professor Kumar, come back to the IMF. The IMF in its projection hasn't taken into account the fact that because of President Trump's tariff policy, the world is passing through uncertainty which threatens both inflation and recession. Therefore, the projected 0.014% difference in GDP between India and Japan could easily turn out to be incorrect. It could be more, it could be less. The uncertainty President Trump has introduced means that this difference of 0.014% could be eliminated, it could be exaggerated, we just don't know.
You're absolutely right. There's too much uncertainty, especially since October, when it was sort of becoming clear that Trump may actually become the president of the US. And the stock markets were reacting to it. The other markets were reacting. The dollar parity with the other currencies was there. Gold, everything was there. So there's worry that there would be inflation with the tariffs. Okay. There's also worry that this could lead to recession in the world economy, because when there's inflation and wages don't rise, demand falls. There's also worry that supply bottlenecks will be there, because differential tariffs would be there on different countries. All these things together made a very uncertain world. And the IMF's data itself on page 3, 1.4, chart 1.4 shows that the huge rise in uncertainty in economic terms, in the entire trade terms, and in the entire economy. Now, given the uncertainty, we don't know which economy will be affected how much by these tariffs, by these trade negotiations that are going on, or as the courts have blocked the tariffs at present, but President Trump will surely appeal. So we don't know. Given all that, we don't know what impact will it produce on different countries, the rates of growth, also on the dollar rupee parity or the dollar yen parity.
I'll come to the dollar rupee parity in a moment's time, but let's first stick to the point you're making. The difference, or rather, I should say, the projected difference at the end of 2025 between India's GDP and Japan's GDP is just 0.014%.
Yes.
I'll repeat that because it's very, very small. 0.014%. And the uncertainty that President Trump has introduced could easily either exaggerate this difference or eliminate it. We just don't know. So it's possible that President Trump's created uncertainty could mean that come the end of the year 2025, that projected increase in the Indian GDP may not happen. It may be still smaller than Japan's, or it may be much bigger than we thought it would be. President Trump's uncertainty is something the IMF hasn't taken on board.
Yes. So while in the chart they reflect that, but in calculation of the GDP growth rates, they haven't taken that into account. And it's the growth rates that will change because the investment pattern in the world is changing.
Okay, let's then come to the point you were making about the exchange rate. Because one more point which the IMF has overlooked is precisely this. When the Indian and Japanese GDPs are compared, we have to first convert rupees and yen into dollars. Now, depending upon how the exchange rate fluctuates in both cases, that could further complicate the situation, couldn't it? And that difference, which is a very small difference in their GDPs of 0.014%, could get eliminated, or it could get reversed, or it could get increased. Once again, uncertainty is there because we don't know how the exchange rates, either the dollar versus the rupee or the dollar versus the yen, will fluctuate.
So you're absolutely right, Karan. I mean, there are several factors which determine the exchange rates of different countries, But at the moment, uncertainty, the price of gold, the fact of differential inflations, these are the important factors that will affect the exchange rate parity between dollar and yen and dollar and the rupee. Now, in any international comparison, you have to convert the GDP to dollar terms so as to make it comparable. You can't compare the yen GDP with the rupee GDP, So therefore, in this conversion, you need the parity, and that parity will get affected by the nature of trade, the impact on our trade, the impact on our currency, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the uncertainty is huge. IMF flags that in its graph, but doesn't take that into account in terms of making the calculations. And therefore, this 0.014% difference could be easily overwhelmed by the nature of inflation and the currency depreciation.
Let's then finally come to your conclusion, and I'll quote what you've written in your Wire article. You say, there is a need to reassess the claim that India's GDP is growing fast and will cross that of Japan in 2025. Your conclusion clearly suggests you don't believe we will overtake Japan at the end of 2025. Am I right?
Yes, you are correct. Because if my hypothesis, there's the unorganized sector that's declining, the organized sector is rising. So our GDP data reflects the rise of the organized sector, but doesn't take into account the decline in the unorganized sector. And even the data from agriculture, the agriculture experts say the data is faulty, because if you look at last year when the government said there was a bumper crop, in spite of the bumper crop, prices were rising. Then they reduced stock holding limits and still the prices rose. Then they banned export and still the prices rose. So many agriculture experts say even the agriculture data is incorrect. Unorganized sector, non-agriculture, we know that the data is incorrect because that data is not collected and there's a decline in major sectors. Whether you look at FMCG, whether you look at trade sector, leather goods sector, major other sectors also. So in other words, the rate of growth, which is 6.5% average over the last 10 years, possibly is more like 2%. If it's 2% and there's a gap of 4% between what's happening and what the government's projecting, it means there's a 42% difference in the GDP between what possibly is there and what the government is projecting. So in which case, we would not have crossed Japan.
We end, therefore, with two crystal clear conclusions. The first, which we reached right at the start of this interview, is India, as of now, today, the 30th of May, has not overtaken Japan. It is not the fourth largest economy in the world. It's projected to overtake Japan and become the fourth largest economy towards the end of 2025, somewhere around December 2025. But the second conclusion we've reached is that you believe, because of the uncertainties in the way India's GDP is calculated, that even come December 2025, you personally believe India will not overtake Japan. That
You're right.
difference of 0.014% in India's favor is unlikely to happen. Am I right?
Yes, I agree. I agree with your conclusion. Thank you.
Professor Kumar, thank you very much for taking time out to talk to me and to explain this subject so clearly, so comprehensively. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks a lot, Karan. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.